have quite a bit of specific cases we're going to test out as we roll this out, but the core premise is that this is going to be what essentially the network will proceed to do on mainnet the moment that the cutoff frame has been reached. We just have preempted the rebuild of the store into the hypergraph already, so we can skip that conversion step as we test this out. For those who are unfamiliar with Quilibrium, I just want to mention real quick, Quilibrium is a peer-to-peer network for confidential compute that makes it easy to run services on the web that keeps your data private, including from those who build services on Quilibrium, whether it's a group chat application like Quorum, a video game matchmaking service, a hobbyist forum, or any other application on the web. Now, I try to use these broadcasts to talk about Quilibrium in more plain terms. We have gotten a lot of feedback about the streams that happen on Twitch and on Twitter itself with the video broadcasts. And those tend to be more developer oriented. And so they tend to be a bit more technically complex. And so we're doing these spaces to try to answer these questions that people have in a bit more of a clear, accessible way. So I'm going to go ahead and jump right in. We actually have quite a few questions this time around, which is awesome. And so I'm going to try to lump a few of them together when there's a lot of overlap so that we don't end up like answering the same question twice. So I'm going to go ahead and get started with one that there's a few different questions around, specifically regarding the fundraise that Quilibrium Inc. is doing for the company itself. So one of the questions works out like this with a pretext. They said, there was a lot of excitement in recent months around the equity raise for Q Inc. that created a lot of FOMO, and I understand previously due to legal reasons you could not disclose or announce. Now that you've hired a couple devs and other resources, is the raise complete or initial round complete? Are you still bootstrapping? And were you overwhelmed or underwhelmed with the equity investment interest given the overall crypto market and decentralized tech bear sentiment? So unfortunately, I can't actually answer that question. Like you had noted yourself, there are legal reasons that we can't discuss the details of a fundraise until the round has fully closed. We are obviously still in the process of that, but when that actually closes out, we'll be happy to answer all the details. Just cannot do that yet. But I did want to acknowledge that those questions were being asked, and I didn't want to just simply be ignored. So let's dive into questions that can be answered. The first is, will emissions drop after the 2.1 update, and how much do you expect them to drop if so? I can answer that actually directly. So because we've been doing the conversion of the mainnet state in the testnet environment, we actually have a really good measurement of what the overall network state will look like in terms of total storage. And so at this point, given how many gigabytes of data have roughly been encoded into world state in the overall hypergraph of the network, we're actually looking at an emissions rate of roughly 102 QUIL per emission interval, which is 10 per 10 seconds globally. So we're seeing a very significant drop off with the 2.1 update. When can we use the Quorum Mobile Beta? I mentioned this in a couple of places, but happy to mention it again. If you haven't signed up for the beta, we have a forum that we've posted a few times on Twitter. Feel free to sign up. All it asks for is an email so that we can get you set up on either TestFlight or Google Play Store for the beta. But also, if you want to use a like just an unlocked, unshackled, de-Googled Android phone, we can also send you the APK directly. But to answer the question of when, we are going to start rolling this out the evening of Friday. So in other words, tomorrow. So stay on the lookout. If you already signed up for the beta, you should be getting an email around how to access that tomorrow. Somebody also asked, how long have you been building Quilibrium for? So yeah, this is more of the deep lore. I actually started the origins of what Quilibrium came to be about 7 years ago, which is really crazy to think about now. Obviously, at that time, it was not even remotely what it is today. It was more of a hobby project, and the original goal was to just build an alternative to Discord, we didn't even have like the notion of a peer-to-peer version at that time. It was basically a federated version. Felt kind of similar to Matrix, but yeah, it definitely changed a lot over 7 years in ultimately becoming a AWS alternative. Can you make an approximate cost comparison, speaking of AWS, between Q storage and AWS S3 or other cloud providers? Yeah, so we're trying to stay as competitive as possible with AWS. AWS has relatively cheap pricing for the storage itself, where they get you as the egress. So if you have a lot of requests on that data, it ends up getting really expensive really fast. And so what we're doing is we're going to emulate their free tier in terms of how much data you can store without having to pay a fee. So we're going to be specifically offering 5 gigabytes of storage free, and then subsequent data added on will have its own pricing tiers. How that pans out with respect to egress is that the network itself has essentially a model where when you're doing queries, you're paying to evaluate the query for that data. And the way that we do that with our S3 compatibility layer is we do have some upper level caching. So if you're doing like a public S3 bucket, then we have additional layers of caching that makes the data readily available without having to re-execute queries. So the overall cost is going to be very deeply competitive in terms of egress, because we're essentially underwriting the egress when it comes down to executing the query on the network, but when it's actually being served at the proxy layer where the data is basically being served up exactly like if you put S3 through a API gateway or some other kind of layer to proxy to it. We're basically cutting past all the costs around that so that it is as cheap as humanly possible. Our target is to basically compete with the current cheapest alternative to S3, which is Cloudflare's R2. What is the utility of the QUIL token? The utility of the QUIL token is to deploy data applications, execute applications on the network. Basically, it's the network's equivalent to a unit of interchange for performing whatever interaction needs to be done on the network. If companies and users can pay in fiat or stablecoins for services, how do you see the token's utility evolving? So that's actually, that comes back around to the notion of what is distinct between Quilibrium Inc. and Quilibrium the protocol. Quilibrium the protocol is the decentralized MPC platform as a service. Quilibrium Inc. is a company that provides managed services that run on top of Quilibrium the protocol. And so our S3 compatibility API is a convenience layer so that people can store data on a hypergraph in a efficiently packed format that retains all the security properties that the encrypted hypergraph offers. So in other words, if you are wanting to store data in a private bucket versus a public bucket, you'd be storing it on the hypergraph in the verifiably encrypted format, so you can rest assured that the data is stored exactly the way you intend it to be, but is only accessible to you. But when it comes to how Quilibrium Inc. is surfacing that, we try to make it feasible for people who want to actually have predictable billing in terms of whatever their regional currency is, that they can do so. So it's not as much of a mental shift to move from a platform like AWS, where they are paying in fiat, to using the Q console and the related managed services. Same kind of concept. You're paying in fiat, but we also do offer the ability to pay in the QUIL and wrapped QUIL tokens. So what is Quorum Apex and how will it work exactly? Quorum Apex is basically going to be our alternative to Discord Nitro. So there's going to be some unique benefits in terms of what an Apex subscriber can do on Quorum. But I think one of the most compelling things that is surprisingly not something Discord really does is when you, for example, boost a server on Discord or subscribe to a space on Quorum, both of those things have very similar perks that are associated with it, but the distinction for Quorum is that if you are a subscriber to a space, the space actually gets a rev split of the overall QUIL tokens that were used to pay for the Apex subscription. So in other words, it's what basically nitro boosting should have been in the first place. Like if you make a really great community, why wouldn't you get some sort of reward in the subscriptions that you've received? And so that's the way that we're approaching it with Quorum Apex. You pay for a month of Quorum Apex, and it splits out to up to 4 subscriptions to different spaces that you're in. And you can obviously subscribe multiple times to the same space, same way you would do with nitro boosting. Okay, now we've got a few questions that are from specific individuals, and I'm going to go ahead and like lump them all together by the asker. So DeFi Square, first off, absolutely love the questions that you asked. You also were on the stream on Tuesday, and it was like I love those questions. So happy to answer these as well. Someone living in a dictatorship country that has no freedom of speech, being an activist can put them in jail for trying to express political opinions. Hosting a blog on Q for journalists will make it impossible for the governments to track any IPs. Will they be safe 100%? So I'll break that down into a couple of different concepts that are important to understand. People try to find privacy on the web in different ways today, even like they'll use proxies, like either a VPN service or they're using something like Tor. And depending on the nature of where you are, what you're doing, what you're intending to do over that proxy, and how you're doing it, all has different effects that can potentially expose you. Tor in of itself is kind of notoriously known as something that's botted to hell by state actors. But those state actors, are in certain countries. They're not in all countries. And so, for example, if you are a journalist that is wanting to, expose like a report from a whistleblower that is based out of like, I don't know, maybe Brazil or Chile or something like that. On Tor, you don't have state actors that are flooding the network with peers that are from those countries. And so demasking the identity of that journalist or the whistleblower is practically impossible. Whereas if it was somebody based out of the US or Germany, which are the 2 major countries that have basically dominated Tor in terms of node coverage to unmask identities, it's actually, you could consider yourself compromised. And so why I mention this is that Quilibrium is a permissionless protocol. People can run nodes anywhere. We leverage approaches that make it much harder in comparison to something like Tor to unmask the identity of somebody who has transmitted data on the network. But that being said, like there's still going to be some degree of self-sufficiency and self awareness that you're going to have when you are engaging in any sort of interaction on the network. One thing I can explain in simpler terms is if somebody hosted a website on Q, for example, and that website had a JavaScript that does browser fingerprinting and identifies a user, that's what the creator of that site can do. Quilibrium does not prevent that because all of what Quilibrium is being used for in that case is hosting a website. So I want to be very explicit that like being a safe 100% still requires, some self-sufficiency in terms of understanding what you're doing in order to avoid any sort of like overall surveillance. If a big tech company has a big number of users, let's say 100 million daily active users, if they wanted to migrate to Q, will Q be able to handle such high traffic of users? And if we said 2 billion users like Facebook, is this theoretically possible? So realistically, the way that we have designed Q is very similar to the shared nothing architecture of SiloDB. And what is important to understand about that approach in the design is that the resource locking that would be required to manage an individual's user's resources does not interfere with any other user's resources. And that statement is kind of complex on the surface, but I'll explain it more like this. When you're using an ERC20 on Ethereum, for example, the way that works is it's a smart contract that has storage that basically provides a mapping of all the users' addresses to a given balance of whatever ERC20 that contract is referring to. And if you make a modification, like you transfer a token, you're just updating the balance values on those two different accounts in the mapping of those account addresses to the balances. And in order to do that at a contract level on Ethereum, this is happening in a single threaded execution context, so they don't have to do any locking. But the downside is, well, you can just literally look at how many transactions per second under high load that Ethereum can actually handle. It ends up being a very severe bottleneck. And so our application design is meant to be like as relatively conflict-free as possible, so that if you did have, say 2 billion users that are individually creating transactions that do not have conflicts with one another, they can all happen in parallel instead of having to be processed in serial. There were two questions around cost, and one is the cost of hosting a website on Q. The other is if there's free hosting options available. Like I mentioned earlier, our Q storage service does have a free tier that is essentially like 5 gigabytes of data free. While not every website would necessarily be able to take advantage of that to host their website in full for free, there's certainly quite a few out there that have relatively minimal payloads that could fit within the free tier. Are there additional costs for security, backups, or performance upgrades? No, that's not really like that's not something that we tack on. Like the notion of replication amongst peers is baked into the protocol. You will not have consensus if you don't have sufficient coverage of data on the network. Security is also it's a mandatory component of the network. The nature of how data is stored on the network itself is through verifiable encryption, and so these are not value adds. These are table stakes for us. How does Quilibrium ensure fast loading times for websites? That's a little bit more complicated of a question in the sense that the Q storage API and the public bucket proxy, which is what would be used to ensure fast loading times for websites, that's more of an engineering question of the managed service rather than Quilibrium, the protocol itself. In terms of fast execution of queries on the network, that's obviously going to be contingent on a number of factors, including the nodes that are processing that query at a given time. But it's something that, as the network continues to grow, continues to improve. So there's a couple more questions that relate specifically to web hosting. Again, these are all specific to Q storage. So this is more of a question about the Q storage offering. But in short, yes, you can host websites on Q storage. The overall response time, the latency that we're measuring for Q storage, we're trying to keep it at in terms of latency for time to return data. Basically when we've fetched the data relevant to the request and returned it back to the requester. We're trying to keep things in terms of tens of milliseconds in response times. And so we employ a lot of layered caching techniques to try to minimize the amount of time it takes to serve a response. Can people migrate an existing website? Yeah, as long as it's a static page. That's the thing that Q storage can support in terms of running a backend service on Q. That's something that would have to happen at a later time. Do I need to buy a domain separately? Yeah, we're not offering domain hosting, a domain management or anything like that yet. We'll give you the necessary CNAME values you have to configure in order to route your domain to the public bucket. But in terms of actually offering domain services, No. There's a few good hosts out there, and depending on the nature of like what your concerns are with respect to domain providers, there's certainly good recommendations out there that are a bit more based and red-pilled, if you will, in terms of what they're willing to tolerate and who they're willing to tell to fuck off with respect to any sort of legal requests. Is there a step-by-step guide or tutorial videos available? Not yet. We are going to, start doing a lot of developer-facing content after the 2.1 release. But yeah, thank you for all those questions. I really love how deep you're willing to dive into this in your questions. Next user was a username of BBBBB. I think that's how it worked out. First is, will customers pay in the QUIL token? And if yes, are they buying it in the background or paying in dollar? What exactly is happening there? Okay, so I think this is again related to questions about QConsole, and that's perfectly fine. The way that we're handling that in terms of what users are paying, like if a user pays QUIL Inc. in fiat to utilize the network with the managed services, Q Inc. has its own amount of tokens that we have earned by running nodes the same as everyone else. And so in terms of like how we actually will pay for services on the network directly, we are paying for services on the network directly, the same as anybody else deploying anything to the network. We're not a specially privileged actor in this space. So literally, like if somebody is wanting to host a website and they're using the Q managed services and deploying it through QConsole, it's still ultimately settling to the network as data on the hypergraph. And that means that we have to pay for that data on the hypergraph, and that data gets paid for in the network native token. Next question was, when can we expect the website revamp with the new brand design from the design team? More on that soon. It's still in progress, but we're getting pretty hopeful about the timing of things, but I can't say for sure when all of it will be ready. But we're going to basically roll it out all at once rather than like piecemeal things out, so that it doesn't cause any confusion, because we're applying this rebranding and redesign to everything, and very excited to present that, but we're going to wait until everything is all in one, ready to go. How is the Q token being used as a utility token? And what exactly is the utility that the token provides in response to storage, KMS, and S3 compatibility? Yeah, so like I said, when data is being stored to the hypergraph, that directly corresponds to a fee. When applications are deployed to the network, like in terms of like these QCL-based applications, that also requires a fee. When you execute applications on the network, that requires a fee. When you query data on the network, if you are not running a node that is holding that data yourself, that also requires a fee. So like just like any other crypto protocol that's out there, like it is a fee consumption oriented network. So like you still have to pay to use the network. All right. I think that is all the questions that I had lined up. So let's see if there was any more. Okay, so I'll go ahead and open the floor to anybody who wants to ask questions on the space. Obviously, you don't have to jump up if you don't feel comfortable talking in public, but if you do, great. If not, then you can leave your questions for the next post where we schedule the next space, or take it to the stream on Sunday. All right, fair enough. So yeah, like I said, this week's going to be a very intense week. We're going to be rolling out the release candidate of 2.1. tomorrow we're going to be rolling out the Quorum Mobile Beta. There's a lot in flight. So very exciting week to follow. And I look forward to seeing you all again this Sunday, where I'll be going through how to build applications directly on Q with QCL. All right, everybody. Thanks for listening, and I will catch you on the next